S1 Literacy Booklet Guide with Voiceover. Page 2, Note Values. There are various different note lengths which you need to understand. Semi-brief, which looks like this and is worth 4 beats. Minim, which looks like this and is worth 2 beats. Crotchet, which looks like this and is worth 1 beat. And the quaver, which looks like this and is worth half a beat. If we have 2 quavers next to one another, like this, we take the tail of each one and tie it together. We call this a beamed quaver, which altogether adds up to 1 beat. So it goes from this, where each individual note is worth half a beat, to this, where we add the half beats together to give us 1 whole beat. Even though they are tied together, each note is still half a beat. Let's look at some examples. Example number 1, which is taken from Note Length Exercises, Exercise 1. First step is to look at the first note and see which of the notes this note is. If we look at the table, this first note is a crotchet, and we know that a crotchet is worth 1 beat. The second note is also a crotchet, and a crotchet is worth 1 beat. We then add those 2 numbers together, which gives us a total of 2 beats. Example number 2. We work out which note the first note is. By looking at the table, we know that this note is a minim, and we also know that a minim is worth 2 beats. We look at the second note, which we know is a crotchet, and a crotchet we know is worth 1 beat. We add these 2 values together, which gives us a total of 3 beats. Example number 3. This is where we bring in our beamed quavers. Now, looking at those first notes, we know that 2 quaver notes, which are half a beat each, are beamed together and equate to 1 whole beat. We look at the second note and we know from looking at the table that this note here is a minim worth 2 beats. In total, 1 beat plus 2 beat gives us 3 whole beats. Example number 4. Our first note here, we know from looking at the table, is a semi-brief. A semi-brief is worth 4 beats. When we look at the second note, we also know that this is a semi-brief and that this is also worth 4 beats. When we add these 2 values together, 4 plus 4, it gives us 8 whole beats. Page 3, the dot. This is the one that confuses everyone. When a dot is added onto a note, it adds on half of the original value. There are 3 steps that we must take in order to break this down. Number 1, ask yourself what the original value of the note is. Number 2, find out what half of that number would be. And number 3, add both of these numbers together. Don't panic, we'll go over some examples together. Example number 1, ask yourself what the original value of the note would be. Step 2, find out what half of that number would be. And step 3, add those numbers together. Here we have a dotted semi-brief. Step 1, the original value of the note. We know that this note is a semi-brief and that a semi-brief is worth 4 beats. So without the dot, on its own, a semi-brief is worth 4 beats. Step 2 is to find out what half of that number would be. So we take our 4, divide it by 2, which gives us 2 beats. Step 3 is simply to add both of these numbers together. So 4 beats, our original number, 2 beats, which is half of that number, in total gives us 6 beats. The answer then is 6 beats. Example number 2. Again, ask yourself what the original value of that note is, find out what half of that number would be, and then add both of those numbers together. This time we have a dotted crotchet. Looking at the table, we know that a crotchet on its own without the dot is worth 1 beat. Step number 2 is to find out what half of that number would be. 1 divided by 2 is a half. If you had 1 whole cake, cut it in half and gave half to the other person, you would be left with half and the other person would have half of the cake. Step 3 is to add both of those numbers together. So your original value, which is 1, your half of that value, which is a half, we add those together, which gives us 1.5 beats, and your final answer would be either 1.5 or 1.5 beats. Page 4, the stave. The stave is made up of 5 lines. When a musical note is placed on the stave, it tells us what pitch the note is and the duration of the note. Your task on page 4 is to draw 10 examples of each note on the staves and the assignment. Tips for teams: use 2 fingers to pinch the screen to zoom in and out so that you can be incredibly accurate. Step 2 is to select a thicker pen to colour in note heads. Page 5, time signatures. So that we do not end up with one long continuous piece of music, we use time signatures to help us out. They help us to stay in time and make it easier to count our note values. You will find your time signature just next to your treble clef like this. You will notice that there is no line in between the 2 numbers because it is not a fraction and should not be written this way. Also, you may have noticed that we do not need to write a line in between them because the 3rd line of the stave already does this for us. The top number of the time signature tells us how many beats there are in a bar. So of course, in this time signature, there are 4 beats in every bar. This means that when my chosen notes reach the value of 4 when added together, I would draw a bar line. Let's look at example number 1. We can see that we have our time signature, which is 4, 4, next to our treble clef. If we look at the top number, which is 4, it tells us that there should be 4 beats in every bar. Our first note that we can see here is a minim. We know that a minim is worth 2 beats. We then have a crotchet. We know that a crotchet is worth 1 beat. We then have 2 quavers beamed together, which we know in total gives us 1 beat. In total, that gives us 4 beats in the bar. We then have what's called a bar line. So from the treble clef to this point adds up to 4 beats, so this line marks the end of our first bar. In the second bar, you can see that it also adds up to 4 beats, and then we have a bar line. At the end of any piece of music, we have a double bar line to show us that the music has finished. This is always a thin line followed by a thicker line. Example 2. If we look at the time signature located next to the treble clef, we can see by looking at the top number that there are 3 beats in every bar. We can count this to double check. 1 plus 1 plus 1 gives us a total of 3 beats, and our beamed quavers, we know when 2 beamed quavers are beamed together, become 1 beat. So separated by a bar line, we then have 1 whole beat, 2 whole beats, 3 whole beats. So there are 3 beats in the bar. Pages 6 and 7, bar lines. Music is divided up by bar lines. You can see this in the video by looking at the blue arrows. The space between the bar lines is called a bar. You can see this in the video by looking at the information circled in the red circles. And at the end of our piece of music, we have what's called a double bar line, which is always a thin line followed by a thicker line, and this tells us that the music is finished. Revisiting this table will come in handy for the questions on pages 6 and 7. Read each question in your booklet very carefully. Questions 4 on page 6 and 9 on page 7. You are being asked how many beats there are in each note. You are not being asked to calculate the total sum of the notes or to write a time signature. Look out for the dot and revisit slides 8 to 12 for a reminder. Questions 5 and 6, which are on page 6. You are being asked to calculate the total number of beats in each bar. Remember that bars are separated by bar lines. You are not being asked to write a time signature, just a number. For example, there are 4 beats in each bar. Questions 7 and 8, which are located on page 7. Fill in the bars to the correct time signature. Try using different note durations. Check the time signature. Remember that the top number tells you how many beats there are in each bar. Remember that bars are separated by bar lines. Use the table on the right to help you to complete each bar. Try to use a different combination of notes for each bar. Question 10 on page 7. Question 10 is the opposite of questions 7 and 8. Check the time signature. Remember that the top number tells you how many beats are in each bar. Pages 8 and 9, the treble clef. Read the instructions in your book carefully. Watch this short video for detailed step-by-step instructions. Pages 10 and 11, the musical alphabet. Musical notation uses the first 7 letters of the alphabet: A, B, C, D, E, F and G. The notes move up and down the stave in steps like this. First, let's look at the names of the notes on the lines. A useful phrase for remembering the names of the notes is "Every good boy deserves football."
Ryan Little.
Example 1. Hint: always count upwards from the bottom line. Bottom line we know is E for every, good, B for boy, D for deserves, which means the note on the fourth line is a D. Example 2. Again, remember we're working upwards from the bottom line, which we know is an E. E for every, G for good, which means that our answer for the second line is a G. As well as 5 lines, there are also 4 spaces on the stave. These spell out the word bass. F, A, C and E. Example number 3. We know that the bottom space is an F. Example 4. Again, we're on a space and we're working upwards from the bottom. We know that the bottom space is F, second space is A, third space is C. Our answer is C. This is a bit of a tricky one, but we do know that the bottom note is an E. What we then have to do is work backwards. So remember there are 7 letters in our musical alphabet: C, D, E, F, G, A and B. We are working backwards from an E, so the note in the space below an E would be a D, and a note 1 note below a D would be a C. Therefore, our answer is C. Pages 12 and 13, right hand notes: C, D, E, F and G. This section is self-explanatory, but read the instructions carefully. Here is an example of how your work should look. In this example, you are asked to draw a line of Ds. The first bar, you are asked to draw crotchets. And the second bar, you are asked to draw minims. And in the third and final bar, you are asked to draw semi-breves. Pages 14 and 15, rests. What we have dealt with so far are the values of sound. Because it is important that each bar adds up to the time signature, we also have values for silence. We have rests in music that mean we play nothing for the length of the rest. Have a look at the table. There is a rest for a semi-breve, a rest for a minim, a rest for a crotchet, a rest for a quaver, and a note which we haven't looked at yet, which is half of a quaver, a quarter. There is even a rest for that one. If a 4-beat note is known as a semi-breve, then a 4-beat rest is also known as a semi-breve rest. In the same way that we can add a dot to a note, we can also add a dot to a rest. When we add a dot, it does the same job, adding on half of the original value.